Welcome to ACOP's Ministry Mind Leadership Podcast Season 2, where we talk to leaders across our fellowship with the purpose of building connection and engagement. I'm Kim Cooper, your host and ACOP Next Gen Catalyst. Join with me as we continue to hear stories each episode from leaders across our fellowship that will challenge and encourage you in your ministry journey. Today with me, I have Mark Buchanan, and I'm really excited to get to interview Mark and have you guys get to know Mark. Mark is an author and a teacher and has lots of great wisdom to share with us. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, it's so good to be with you. I'm well, thank you.
Good. So, Mark, Ministry Mind podcast, we have lots of listeners that are in a wide range of generations, but predominantly we speak lots to our next generation, our up and coming leaders. So we want to encourage all of our leaders today about a topic that you write about, which is Sabbath. And so yeah, I'm excited to do that with you today. But first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about who Mark Buchanan is?
All right. Thanks, Kim. I came to faith in my early 20s, so I actually really love having any kind of conversation with or influence upon sort of young leaders, because I came to faith at that age where things were all in tumult.
Mm-hmm.
And very soon after coming to faith, I found myself thrust into pastoral ministry.
Wow.
And so 24 years I spent as a pastor, a lot of it just scrambling, just trying to figure stuff out, because I was ill prepared, didn't have the training, just kind of thrown in the thick of it. And again, so I really love to engage in a conversation with leaders, and if there's any wisdom I've gained from all my bumbling about, I'd love to kind of impart that. So that's 24 years in pastoral ministry, and then the last 9 years I've been teaching pastoral theology at Ambrose University and Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
And simultaneous with that, my wife and I do a ministry called New Story Community, and it's alongside Indigenous women in second stage of recovery. So it's women who have been through some kind of recovery program and yet are looking to kind of get more established in their identity and a little further along in their healing journey, and to build some vocational skills. So our program is designed to kind of do all of that in a very intense community. So it's a small group, and we really do life together. It's quite extraordinary, and we see a lot of life change, but we also have to kind of we're up close to some of the heartache.
Right.
So with all of that, I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, I have the pastoral experience that's now 9 years. I'm on the other side of it. I've been teaching about theology without necessarily being in the thick of doing ministry. But in the last year, I've really jumped back into a sort of on the ground, in the trench kinds of ministry.
Wow. So what do you like to do for hobbies?
Oh, well, various things. I actually love walking, and where I live right now is on a small island, and virtually we would walk even if we're not sort of intending to, because that's how you get around on this island. But I really do find something kind of life-giving about carrying myself around and beholding God's creation. I'm a scuba diver, though. It's been last time I dove was in Bali 2 years ago, just before the pandemic hit. So it's been a while since I got in the water. Love riding a motorcycle. So one of the things I've missed living where I am right now is I'm a bit of a distance away from my motorcycle.
I was reading your book and you were talking about jumping off cliffs. Have you done that recently?
No, I mean, that's, that goes back a few years, and I'm now in my 60s, so I'm a little more cautious, a little, maybe wiser, but
wiser, cautious.
To be honest, 2 years ago, and actually, I guess it would be 2 summers ago or 3 summers ago before the pandemic. I did actually. I took went down whitewater rafting, and partway through we uh, brought the boats up on the beach and got up in about a 30, not a huge cliff, but a 30-foot cliff, and dove off. So
You're
that
crazy.
was the last time. It was years ago.
That's awesome. So I made mention of the book that I just finished reading,
Right.
and that you have, how many books have you written?
10. I've published 10.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So the one that I just finished is called The Rest of God. Can you
Yeah.
tell us why you chose to write that book?
Well, I discovered Sabbath in the nick of time. I really was dying from just overexertion in ministry and stress, and actually getting really angry
Right.
about feeling that there was more to do, and took more
Right.
skill, more energy, more gumption than I had, and just was wearing out.
Mhm.
And in that season, my wife and I discovered, this is going back 20 or so years, this beautiful gift of Sabbath. Never had heard it. I can't remember ever hearing a sermon on it or reading a book
Right.
on it. And I probably had, but I wasn't listening. But this discovery was life-giving and really reordered our lives, and re-energized our ministry. But the writing of it then came a couple years later, where you remember that story in Second Kings where a bunch of lepers, or a couple maybe, or they find the Syrian camp has been sort of abruptly evacuated, and there's all this food, and everybody's starving in Jerusalem, and these couple lepers are gorging themselves on all this food, and then they say, "Hey, this isn't right. Everybody's starving there, and we're
Mhm.
eating like kings. We should go tell people about we found food."
Right.
And I felt, okay, I bet you there's a few people out there, and especially leaders,
Yeah.
who are gutting it out, and just chafing in the harness, and
Mhm.
getting bitter, and getting they feel that they're somehow God's left them to work this sheepfold all alone, etc.
Mhm.
And I bet you if I wrote a book just sort of exploring what I had discovered, that would maybe resonate. And it turns out it's been I can't there's another book I have that sold a lot, and I think they're sort of almost neck and neck, but this has been, as far as bestsellers go, my one of my best sellers, because I think it
Yeah.
just speaks especially to leaders
Definitely.
who needed to hear that God's given you this permission and this gift of rest.
Yeah. And especially from someone that knows what it's like to fight it out day in and day out in pastoral ministry, in ministry in general, and family life as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it, and and my experience with discovering Sabbath came out of exactly that. I wasn't sort of some guy living, running a retreat center or something. I was in the grip and in the thick of doing daily ministry. And my family was young.
Yeah.
So we had 3 children, all who had lots of needs that they placed on us.
Yeah.
And so all that pressure that people feel virtually any season of life, but
Mhm.
especially I think it's intense when you're a young leader,
Yeah.
that there's way more to do here than I have skill or time or energy to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't know how to manage it or balance it or find my way through it. And
Mhm.
um, and realizing, and the one thing, you feel you can't do is just stop. And that's what actually Sabbath literally means, stop.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't literally describe a day of the week. It describes an inactivity. It means stop it.
Stop it.
Stop it.
Yeah.
And stunning, right? Revolutionary that in the
Yeah.
midst of all these pressures and demands of God comes to us and says, stop.
Yeah.
No, but I'm not done. No, stop. But it's not perfect. No, stop. But no, please listen. Stop.
Mhm.
See what happens if you stop.
Hmm.
And so I dared to stop, and found out
Love
that
it.
a lot of life lies on the other side of that stopping.
So good. So tell me, as you began, like, so you decided, okay, I'm going to write this book. I'm learning how to live it. You probably put a little bit more study into it as you were preparing to write, and as you were writing it, God was probably revealing more even to you about it. What surprised you that you learned even more about Sabbath that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. It's such a good question, Kim, because I'm trying to go back, the 20 or
Yeah.
so years ago, and
Yeah.
I've been trying to inhabit this world since that time. But what really upended me or surprised me, I didn't see it coming, was I was really stunned at the time that God in the creation uh, stopped,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
he actually created and blessed the Sabbath day as a sort of the last act of creation is not humanity, it's Sabbath.
Yeah.
It's a gift of giving this rest, and then he himself enters it.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't just say, you guys are going to get on my nerves. You're going to get all bent out of shape. You're going to get, just irritating to be around. Bad, representatives of me. So I'm going to give you this thing. God Himself enters the rest and says, "Come join me."
Yeah.
And this discovery that God is this God who transcends human need, and yet so wants us to receive this gift that He Himself goes first
Hmm.
stunned me. Like it was a revolution in my thinking. It's right there in the scriptures, but I'd
Yeah.
missed it.
Yeah.
I think the second thing, and hopefully we'll have a bit of opportunity to talk a bit more about this in the podcast, Kim. Uh, the discovery, and this has been ongoing actually through my study and my own experience of Sabbath, that it's an invitation to come back to ourselves.
Mm.
That built into the practice of Sabbath is a recovery of something shattered, broken, lost in my own identity.
Hmm.
That's actually built in. I didn't understand that. Even when I wrote the book, I didn't fully understand that. And so a lot of my reflecting on the Sabbath after has been focused on how I become myself afresh. I become the person God made me to be afresh.
Right.
And I rest.
Right. So I had the privilege of sitting in one of your classes, one of your preaching
Oh,
classes.
perfect. Yeah,
We
okay.
had a good time.
Oh, good.
And I know that you're quite the wordsmith. You are a writer by trade, and you preach lots. And I know that you love to, even just in I listened to the audiobook, and just even hearing your words as you spoke about Sabbath in the book. Um, I want to hear succinctly in one or two sentences, tell me why you think Sabbath is important for us today.
Because we imitate God in order to find out yet again we are not God.
Right.
So he rests and he says, "Come and imitate me, do this."
Yeah.
But in the imitation of God, we discover all of our God complex, all of the ways we've distorted our own identity, the way we've actually done harm in the world to
Mm.
organizations, people around us by the God complex. And so this is, we imitate God in Sabbath and discover afresh our need for God, that we're beloved of God, but we're not God.
Yeah.
So that would be one of the key things I say would be important. The second is though I don't think Sabbath is designed to make us more creative or productive, it's designed just simply as a gift that you step into.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does make us more creative and more productive.
Mm-hmm.
So if we actually dare to stop for longer than we think we can, 24 hours, and completely just back away from all the things we think have to be done, we'll find when we take those things up again, we have a perspective on them, a wisdom about how to solve problems that we're completely stumped by before we stopped, more energy to do them, and we'll get more done in less time. So more
Mm-hmm.
productive, more creative. And that, I think, I've rarely come off a Sabbath where I don't find, even yesterday we took a glorious Sabbath, and This morning I had to write something that a lecture I have to deliver, and I found the energy and the thoughts that I'd been struggling to kind of put this together, and it was just there.
Yeah.
And it was sort of just flowing up out of me from just leaving it be for 24 hours, just not
Wow.
vexed by it anymore. And again, so I don't think God made Sabbath to say, listen, I need you more productive, more creative. So here's a thing and take a day off, but I want you to come back and, double it up next, on Monday. I don't think that's how Sabbath works, but it does tend to have that fruit or benefit.
It's funny how we try to make everything into an equation that makes sense to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then like I know that the importance of Sabbath, and especially as a ministry leader, that we need to take it, but it seems in my brain so often, like, I love how you're like, stop stop the perfection, stop, but it's not done yet, and so we're always trying to achieve and accomplish and get lists done, and maybe that's just my personality, but I think there's a lot of us out there that feel that way as ministry leaders, and the pressure on us. So you talk about in the book that we often, because we're so busy caring for others, that we miss out on the rest and play of God. And that idea, that hit me, because I even struggle to stop and play with my children, or because it's not checking something off my list. And I loved that section where you talked about the rest and play of God being purposeful. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think there's, just to sort of back up a moment, there's the whole notion of the playfulness of God has been underemphasized in sort of theology in general. Jürgen Moltmann, the great German theologian, wrote a book many years ago called Homo Ludens, the man who plays. And it was a reflection of the God who plays. It's the only book of his that I'm aware of that's out of print. Like, it just didn't have an audience. And yet there's a sense of God's playfulness is built into the very, opening chapters of Genesis, where he's creating with this kind of abandon, this artistic abandon. Just go for a walk in the creation and notice that God loves color and movement and shape and variety.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't, you live in the prairies where there's glorious grasslands. Actually, I've fallen in love with grasslands.
Yeah.
And it's certain, either spring when they're all coming up, or fall when there's all these hues, this rainbow.
Or the living skies, right?
The living sky, right? It's like an ocean up there. And this thing where God could have made it monochrome. He could have made it just a one shape thing. He could have made it simply utilitarian and functional.
Right.
But he made it weird and strange and beautiful, and in some ways useless. Some of it just completely useless for no reason but the pure enjoyment of this thing.
Yeah.
Well, implicitly, that's a God who plays. And so I think that, if everything about us is either a distortion, a reflection of, or a distortion of the image of God.
Yeah.
I mean, to be humans, we're made in the image of God, but sin is a distortion of that.
Right.
So everything about us is either recovering of the image of God within us, or it is a pursuit of, somehow a distortion. Something got messed up and broken. And usually it's somewhere in between. But if God is a God of play, then I think that any step toward, and a God who rests, any step toward that is a move toward restoring something of the image of God in us. I know a lot of artists. Sometimes I think I am one, but I'm not sure. But I mean, there's no possibility of creating art without a sense of making mistakes, but also playfulness. I've got to sort of enter into this, not in some. You talk about that sort of calculation. We have a formula, we have an equation for it. Well, if you're going to do art, you have to, in some way, step back from that, even if underneath that is something of a technique. You step back from the technique to be free to dance or to paint or to sculpt. That's where the artistry starts to come in. And so I think that's an act of play in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And so I even, coming to the thing we're talking about is ministry. I'm not even advocating always just, you need a few hours every week or whatever, you play with the kids or you go and play your favorite sport or something. What about ministry as play? What about engaging the preaching task or leadership
Right.
task and bring this sort of artistry to it where I could really mess up? I mean, this could be either an act of, masterpiece I create, or people looking at it like, cocking their head either way and saying, what is that thing? Is that a helicopter or what is that you made there? And there's a sense where if we're not going to kind of enter into it with that, you wonder if I wonder if some ways the church, many of us feel, is stuck in some significant ways. And if it's not to some extent a fear of actually just kind of, why not throw some paint at the canvas and see what
Wow.
happens?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So how do you practice that, and what does that look like for you? I know that that's different. Maybe you even have to answer what that looked like for you in pastoral ministry and what that looks like for you now, because it's probably very different.
It is different. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, 24 years in pastoral ministry, I want to acknowledge how deeply I felt, and probably most feel, the weight of responsibility, the
Yeah.
constraints that are placed on it. You can't get up there and just riff in the pulpit and sort of wonder, openly about ethical things or theological
Yeah.
things, because it's just going to get you in trouble. It's going to confuse people terribly, right?
Right. And oftentimes it's like, do I have time to be creative? Because I've got to do a funeral on Wednesday and then I've got to be ready to go on Sunday.
And that sermon I'm working on, and and indeed. So I want to acknowledge, I get that world. I'm not quite inhabiting it the way I used to.
Right.
And indeed, being a professor means you go and mess with people's heads to some extent. And we had that fun class together. You know how
Yeah.
sometimes I would just kind of stir stuff up for the sake of stirring it up. You just don't really have the freedom of doing that as a pastor. However, what I do remember is, there's lots of things in terms of how I engaged it, but I had a group of friends, and I really do think that Sabbath is about the kind of this intentional building of and spending time with friends, and wasting time with friends. But part of the wasting time is that we created a place of safety with one another, where we could have the conversations, explore the things that really would have got us, probably run out of town if we did that in the pulpit. And I'm even I'm aware, this is, you're a denominational leader, and this is going out to people and stuff. So I want to be very careful what I'm saying here. But really, who do you be honest with
Right.
about your deep wondering that isn't, you're not ready, nor are you settled in what you feel about it or think about. There's a standard kind of conventional way you should think about it, but you're just
Right.
wondering.
Yeah.
And whom do you kind of process that with, in a way that's fun? It's it, it 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 actually leads to some kind of insight. You're not worried about your job being on the line, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
you asked about Sabbath. I actually think, like, increasingly, especially in the years since my children all moved out and whatnot, I really try to make part of my Sabbath just being with people, and sometimes going into those kind of conversations that are rich, and there's no script, and there's no kind of like, you can't say that here.
Yeah.
And it's not about, that I'm filled with doubts or anything like that. It's just, I wonder about stuff.
Right.
And, in Jewish tradition, actually, one of the things we could learn from the rabbinical and Jewish tradition is how much a theological community was a community that you really kind of wrestled stuff out.
Right.
Ways it wasn't cantankerous or rancorous, but it was really kind of, so much wasn't quite fixed as we want it to be. So I'm sort of rambling away here, but I do think that, like, there's the Sabbath is this day where all the normal kind of workaday boundaries or constraints are sort of removed, and we kind of just enter into this life in God and in the creation and the community that God has opened up to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that anything we're doing that is kind of removing the normal sort of burdens of, schedule and whatnot, and agenda that we put onto that anything we do is probably a good Sabbath practice. We may not come away that we've got now. In fact, it's non-utilitarian. We're not even trying to necessarily figure stuff out. We're just kind of living life with one another.
Yeah, I like that idea of, and I think what I'm hearing you say is the idea of learning how to really understand the difference between being and doing.
Yeah.
Stop doing and we just start being.
So, well, yeah, because necessarily we're in a world, and God has actually designed it this way: 6 days shall you work.
Yeah.
That's built into the Sabbath law. So it's not like, it's come, and live a life of endless sort of contemplation and just musing. That's not what Sabbath is. It's take one day to do that, of just contemplation, musing, resting, being, and then get back to the schedule, get back to the agenda, get back to the production line. Do that. Write your sermon.
Yeah.
Meet with your leaders. Keep it to an hour. That sort of thing, right?
Right.
So those things aren't wiped out.
No.
They're not abolished. They're just in the midst of it comes this thing that's a brand new thing. It's not like the other thing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of radical freedom in a sense. It's revolutionary freedom in that one day. Yeah. And that's really what Jesus came to. I mean, why he's blowing away the religious mind, that they're just getting uptight, is they have imposed the structures, agendas, and schedules and expectations of their world onto the Sabbath day. In fact, they've kind of doubled down on it and created even more structure on the Sabbath day. Right. And then Jesus comes and just starts like, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to set a bunch of people free and do a bunch of stuff,
Yeah.
That people sort of rediscover the beauty of the creation, the beauty of community, the beauty of their God, the beauty of who they are.
I love this because I think that a lot of us think fairly legalistically, or even Sabbath just becomes another tick on our to-do list, and you have to accomplish something still by Sabbath. And so I'm loving this conversation because it's just even the idea of doing Sabbath with others, not just closing yourself in your prayer closet with your Bible for 8 hours, or this idea of doing and enjoying, and being and enjoying. It's just awesome. It's really good. I love it. One point you made in the book that stuck with me was when Jesus said to the disciples that he had food that they knew nothing about. And his food was doing the will of the one who sent him. So I love that. Let's kind of, I want to hear you play that out for us. What are you talking about when you brought that up? What was Jesus talking about, and how do we incorporate that into what we're practicing?
Yeah, the context is John 4 and the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, and Jesus sits down at the well. The boys have gone into town to go get some pizza or whatever, and he sits down at the well, and this woman comes up, and they get in a conversation. But the story starts, Jesus is tired, he's thirsty, and he's hungry. Mm-hmm. In fact, he begins the conversation, woman, can you give me something to drink? Mm-hmm. And the story ends where she hasn't given him a drink. No. She hasn't, he doesn't take any, he hasn't got any rest. He's entered into ministry again. Yeah. And he refuses the food they've brought. So he starts weary, thirsty, hungry, and doesn't get a break, doesn't get a drink, and doesn't eat. And he says, I have food you know nothing about, is to do the will. And so there's a sense where what does replenish us in our thirst or hunger and our weariness? And it's to reconnect the work that we do thing that God's up to in the world. So
Right.
my work is to do and complete the will of the one who sent me. And I actually think when we get really tired, we actually lose that connection. I think we
Right.
just no longer can see that the sermon I'm preparing or preaching,
Yeah.
this person who's in my office angry about something or sad about something or confused about something,
Yeah.
uh, they're just kind of taking up my time. I don't, whatever. I think that when we're tired, we lose that sense that I'm actually participating
Right.
in the very thing God has chosen me for.
Yeah.
And when I reconnect with that, it fills me, even if I'm in the midst of doing it. So there, it's this ethic. I think a reimagining of ethic of work. We famously have what's called the Protestant work ethic. Comes from the sociologist Max Weber. The sense that we're just going to we're going to white knuckle our way through and just work, and work hard.
Yeah.
I want to reimagine the work ethic as actually this connecting the work of our hands, as menial as it can be at times, with the thing that God's doing in the world and invite us to be part of. And I think that's the food that that those who just are just have the legalism or the work agenda know nothing about. And I think that when we find our work, whatever our work is, getting that place where it's just dull, it's just tedious, it just feels empty, that it's probably not that you just need to recommit. I think you need to reimagine that how your work actually is somehow cooperating, participating in the very ways God is making himself known and present and coming to people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said about how Sabbath then reorients us to that work. And I
Yeah.
think that that's fitting where it when we aren't tired, like you're saying, then we're able to reorient and reconnect with that food of doing the will of God.
Yeah, and I think probably all your listeners, I mean, I imagine, Kim, you've probably had this in this last week, and I would imagine all your listeners had that moment where they got a call or, some emergency came up and they're like, oh no, and I just wanted to take the day off or take a break or whatever. And
Yeah.
yet you entered into it. In the midst of it, you actually discovered, oh my goodness, this is God brought me into this is a God moment. This is a God encounter.
Yes.
I can
Yeah.
feel the Spirit giving me words to say. God's breaking my heart for this person or giving me wisdom and to speak or whatever.
Yeah.
And you come away from that and you should be more tired, but you're not.
But you're not.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a thing called adrenaline and all of
Yeah.
that. But there's a sense where I just feel like I got a great nap or I just ate a great meal. And yet I got none of that. I just poured
Right.
myself out.
Yeah.
And I think we're discovering some of that real food that sometimes in our weariness we know nothing about.
Yeah. So, can you give listeners some tips? And thinking about that ministry leader, that pastoral leader, that youth pastor that's, just they're in the trenches right now, about how they can find that quietness or find that reconnection with the Lord. Just some tips on how do they do that in the distractions of all those responsibilities to their ministry, to their families, and all those things that are fighting for attention.
Yeah, it's so good. And indeed, there is, as you say, this almost paradox that in one
Yeah.
sense, we're invited into kind of reimagining our work, but we're
Right.
also God is inviting us into this place of, will you just stop? Will you rest?
Yeah.
And that's goes throughout the scriptures, actually, not just in the Sabbath. It's
Yeah.
often God saying to Israel, I wanted to give you rest, but you just wanted to stay busy. What's that about? So some real practical stuff is for the first year or so of Sabbath, my wife and I practiced something called, we used what's called a Sabbath box.
Hmm.
And you could make a fancy one, or you could just use like we did, a cardboard box. And what we did is we took the things that most represented that which was most represented our sort of workaday life. And in
Okay.
those days, it was my day timer. Now it might be your phone or something like that. But
Yeah.
that thing that was most likely, not just representative, but if it's a device, has the power to pull you very abruptly back into that workaday world.
Yeah.
We put it in the box and put the box in the closet and shut the closet door, and we just basically isolated. We quarantined the thing for 24 hours.
Wow.
That was really, I mean, it was hard because we found out how addicted I was addicted to my day timer. We're not even talking devices at that point.
Yeah.
uh, and how addictive these things are, and how much dopamine or whatever we're getting just every time the thing
Yeah.
pings, and how we justify it, like I'm just going to answer this text or email or whatever, and then it won't be on my mind anymore, and really all we do is insert it deeper into our mind. So just the practice of putting that thing away, where if I had a panic moment, which I usually did, especially the first few months, where's that thing? Where is my thing? Where did I put? Oh, and then, oh yeah, it's in the box in the closet, in the back of the closet. The thing is safe. Yeah, and then it just kind of getting that distance from it was really, really, really good. And so something like that, I would really recommend if there's a way you could physically almost separate yourself from the thing that's tugging you. The other is, and again, for about the first year or so, we did a practice that's well attested in Jewish observation of Sabbath. We lit a candle to welcome the Sabbath. And then when the Sabbath went away, we blew a candle out. Now we actually snuffed it out at night, because I do advocate for taking a Sabbath from evening to evening, starting with a dinner on one evening and then ending with a dinner on the second evening. And sort of,
Okay.
you start with a slowing down, not a ramping up.
Yes.
You're winding down. It starts in community. Usually you're with people, you're feasting, you linger over the feast. There's some kind of just gathering to be with one another after, and then to bed. And so there's this kind of winding down, and then you wake to a day that's already sort of awaiting you. So I really do advocate for that. But we would start that Sabbath meal by lighting a candle and effectively welcoming the Sabbath. Would again, so we didn't have a fire in the night. We'd snuff it out at night, but we'd relight it in the morning, and then at the evening, as we finished our meal, we'd blow the Sabbath out in anticipation of the next one coming. And just working it off in that simple, symbolic way was really helpful. Um, and so I just think just some sort of simple steps like that. There's one last thing, and this became more meaningful to me as time went on. The Sabbath, in again Jewish practice, has been viewed as a queen or a bride coming to visit you, and this notion that the special guest is coming. Now that never worked for me. It just made me anxious. The queen of something or another was going to come to my home. So I just thought, no, all I do is just get stressed out. But I did start to think about, well, who are those people that if they're coming over, like I'm giddy, like I'm silly, I'm just so excited that that person's coming over to get to spend time, and it's the dear friend, and actually it's one of those rare things where we're couple friends. So we my wife connects deeply with this guy's wife, and me with him. If we get to spend time with, I think it's mutual. We're just silly, like we just can't wait. And we just can't wait to sort of, we'll say, I love to go to bed by 10 o'clock at the latest, but we'll stay up till midnight, 1 a.m. just talking.
Yeah.
And it's just this constant kind of enjoyment of each other's company. And it's so sad when we have to, head home.
Yeah.
If I think of Sabbath as my friends coming, or we're going there, it emotionally kind of creates it just opens something inside of me that I want this thing to come, and I get ready for it. My anticipation is heightened. And so, and I spend it differently. I enter it differently. When I'm with these friends, I maximize the enjoyment of just being in their presence. I don't go off and say I need an hour to go look at my Facebook or something. I just didn't maximize.
Rude.
So anyhow, that works for me. And so some kind of image, like what would be the best possible kind of day for you?
Right.
If you can just kind of insert that, the emotions that you have around that, and kind of transfer that over into your anticipation and celebration of Sabbath, I think that will go a long way.
The next question I was going to ask you is about the differences between Sabbath, vacation, and sabbatical. And really, what you're talking about. I mean, we all prepare and take all this time, and there's so much anticipation when we're looking towards a vacation.
Yeah.
And really what Sabbath is us doing that weekly.
Weekly. Yeah. Weekly, where it's just kind of like that complete sort of freedom, stepping away from all that, all that you carry and all the stress and all the doing of it. You get that on a weekly basis, 24 hours, 52 days a year, by the way, which is pretty, it's like a sabbatical.
And then I was thinking about, I recently saw something that Carey Nieuwhof put out, and he said something about, sabbaticals, the power move of the year, coming out of this pandemic, and people think that sabbatical is going to save them. But if you're not practicing Sabbath,
I would totally agree. Yeah.
Your sabbatical is not going to do anything for you. You're going to come back and go straight into the weariness.
Yeah. So let me just say something very briefly. I think the difference between sabbatical and vacation is what centers it. And Sabbath is really centered in coming back to a relationship with God, but also all that God has made us to be in relationship with. So one another, with ourselves, with our creation. So all the things that got broken and shattered in the garden when we said no to God's loving gift to walk with him. So we broke relationship with creation, with our God, with one another, with ourselves. All that starts to come back. And so the Sabbath is really a centering in that, whereas vacation is some way an escaping. It's kind of, let's get away from it. And therefore, because it lacks that center, I think it can be in itself quite exhausting. And we're seeing that more and more, that people come back from vacations tired.
They need a holiday from their holiday.
Yeah. So that would be my simple, it's about what's at the center of this.
Yeah.
With sabbatical, I would totally agree. I haven't seen this article by Nieuwhof, but if you don't know how to Sabbath, you don't know how to do sabbatical. It's just quite that simple. It'll just be endless time of you being frustrated and extending and exerting yourself in ways that are not actually renewing you. I've known a number of people who've taken the sabbatical. Finally, they won it, and they thought this was going to be their redemption. And they had no practice of Sabbath, and they some of them virtually had emotional breakdowns during the sabbatical. Because they'd have no rhythm, no muscle memory for actually resting in a good way. So I think Sabbath really is this thing that we learn now. The great book by Andy Crouch called Playing God, and he actually, his last chapter is on what's called the Sabbath ladder. And he says that we learn Sabbath in order to learn the Sabbath year, or the sabbatical. And we learn the Sabbath year in order to learn the year of Jubilee, which is that 50th year where everything goes free, everything comes back. That if we don't have a Sabbath, we'll never have a proper Sabbath year. If we don't have a Sabbath day built into our week, never have a Sabbath year or sabbatical in any meaningful way. And if we don't have a Sabbath year built into the rhythms of our life, basically, because you only probably get one in your lifetime, you're not going to have a Jubilee where everything just comes back. Everything's given back. Everything's restored.
It goes into my next question about exploring the relation with remember, reflect, anticipate. And I especially really loved that idea of remember, and how you explained it as and then member. So like the putting back together. And that was very, that I learned by just like, as I'm listening, seeing pictures, and I was like, I love that. I'm going to remember that. And so explain to the listeners what you meant by that.
Yeah. So, and actually, it's weirdly at the concept of remembering as remembering, actually taking the things that got broken, scattered, fragmented, the
Yeah.
members that all sort of somehow got disintegrated, and you bring those back into their the proper relationship and into wholeness. That's actually the root of the concept of remember.
Right.
It's actually weirdly in a different etymology, the root of the word religion is to ligament. And so these things that got sort of broken off now get brought back together. So true religion is a true remembering, it's a putting back together. And the distortion of religion is it just fragments more. But having said that, very much remembering is part of it's just part of the spiritual practice of Israel and of the church. It's thick through throughout the Bible. Just remember. And remember as not just kind of like, can you remember the story when grandma, whatever, but the sense of keep bringing these things that are in the ways we live life that keep getting broken apart and fragmented together, just keep bringing them back together into some kind of completeness and whole. And Sabbath is about remembering in all of that sense. We kind of recall, we bring back together the story of God with us, God for us, God among us in the image of God, us called to the work of God in the world and all that. We bring that back, but we also kind of our own broken, scattered, fragmented self are pulled back. And so that centering thing I talked about is very crucial, is that all the ways we've been dismembered become remembered in the Sabbath. At a very practical level, many rabbis talk about that both these verbs, remember and observe or anticipate, are kind of operative in our practice of the Sabbath. In fact, one of the version of the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment, is remember it, and one is observe it. And they say that remembrance is sort of that we live between Sabbaths. Basically, we're always sort of remembering the Sabbath we just had.
Right.
We're living in the memory of that Sabbath. And then we get halfway through the week, we're anticipating, we're observing, we're getting ready for the Sabbath we're about to have.
Right.
So since our lives are lived between Sabbaths, and it's kind of a cool way to think about it. I mean, it's different from living for the weekend or living for the next holiday. A lot of us do that, right? We just kind of live in the weekend we had and the weekend we're coming, or the holiday we had and the holiday we've got. But this living between Sabbath is, if you put this word remember in it, that I'm actually anticipating when I was last Sabbath, when I got a little more whole than I had been, and anticipating a return to a little more wholeness than I feel right at the moment.
So in my job with ACOP, I work with lots of young leaders. And so tell me what you think would be the differences between the generations and how they would see Sabbath. Like, we're talking, how do the Gen Zs and the millennials and the Gen Xers and then the boomers, like, how do they view and practice Sabbath differently? Have you been able to observe that?
This, COVID has been an enforced reorientation to time and space.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, part of the boomer generation, I've kind of fought it tooth and nail. As the younger you are, the more you're like, that's the new normal. And so there's a kind of there's sort of an important reimagining and reorienting. The one thing I would say, this very briefly, I think my generation, boomer generation, are recovering from a work ethic that was nearly idolatrous. Our commitment to doing the job, getting the job done, always thinking of the job, never letting the job, out of our reach. I'm wondering if Gen Z is. I don't think that they're sort of the practices of leisure, whatever, are idolatrous. But I do sometimes look and wonder if there could be more work ethic.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if it's an opportunity to not pick up the work ethic that my generation has, which again, I don't want to, there's nothing really in it that I'd say, oh, here's the gift. But what we talked about earlier, that sense of the Lord is called you to a task, and
Yeah.
to put your hand to that task, without looking back, in a sense, you put your hand to plow and not look back. But it's more this, don't lose the connection between the things God's asking you to do and how he's being present in the world through your doing them. And I think that's where my generation just got so busy being busy that we really detached those things. And it all became about the work and the accomplishment of the work and the performance of the work and the rewards of the work. And rather than, oh my goodness, I get to join God
Yeah.
in his mission in the world. So I would just say, and that's a very generalized comment, but that just sometimes I'm just like, initiative. I there's sort of seems to be a lack of initiative sometimes in people, etc.
Yeah. When we were talking about the creativity of God, never have we seen such a time where people are being so creative with their work. And, like all of a sudden, it's not in a box, it's not in an office, it's not so that's kind of cool. So, okay. I always ask this question near the end of my podcasts, but I'm going to ask it to you a little differently. So our podcast called Ministry Mind.
Yeah.
So I always ask people, so what does it mean to be ministry minded to you? But I want to ask it a slightly different to you. I want to ask you, in the light of our topic today, what does it mean to be ministry minded when we're thinking about the study and practice of Sabbath?
Oh, wow. That's so good. It, the story of Martha and Mary isn't a Sabbath story, but it's about resting, it's about stopping. Martha wants her sister Mary to come help her in the kitchen and ask Jesus to scold Mary, and Jesus says no. Yeah. She's chosen better things. Stop.
Yeah.
But that story is told in Luke 10. The other two stories in Luke 10 are all about going and doing stuff. It's all about ministry. The first is about Jesus sending out the 72 to take the gospel to, this town's roundabout. It's very urgent. Go, go, go. And the second story is this Good Samaritan story. Help everybody you find in the ditch, pay the price. Interrupt your own work to make it happen. And so then, in a sense, the two stories begin Luke 10 are all about ministry, and the second is about stopping. I think that really what is being highlighted in this narrative form is this rhythm that we need to sort of take seriously if we're in a life of ministry, where we're trying to join God in what he's doing in the world. He's trying to help people out of ditches. He's trying to take good news to the villages roundabout. And it's urgent that if we don't have this other part where we just stop and sit and listen and receive, then at some point the ministry is going to suffer grievously. We're going to be bitter in it, or we're going to tell people about Jesus, but we're not going to look or sound very much like Jesus in the telling of it. We're going to end up in all the kind of legalism and frustration that besets those who actually are not abiding in Christ. So I think that really the rhythm there is, build this in. I would urge your listeners to really take seriously this gift, to embrace and receive this gift of Sabbath, and stop, really seriously stop, and just see how God uses that to renew you, to recenter you. That I think that you'll find that you're going and you're doing, and all the things of ministry will be. Again, I don't think the purpose of Sabbath is to make you more creative, productive, but I think you'll actually enjoy what you're doing a lot more.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very, very, very much for coming and visiting with me today and encouraging our listeners on this topic. I know that it will be really good spiritual food for them to ingest and to ponder and to put into practice. And I'm really excited to hear feedback from some of this challenge to our listeners today. And I want to thank you specifically for taking the time out of your week to do this with me. If listeners want some further resources and that sort of thing, obviously, I would highly recommend your book, The Rest of God. How else or what else might they do to get into contact with you or to get resources that you have given?
I have a website, markbuchanan.net, and
Okay.
you can find out information about them. And I mean, the number one book I actually recommend on Sabbath is, I cited it earlier, Rabbi Joshua Abraham Heschel, simply called The Sabbath. It's a bit of a tough go. It's a tiny little book, about 100 pages, but it's weird. But honestly, it's a beautiful kind of celebration, almost a rhapsody to the Sabbath. And I would highly recommend that. I've sometimes called my book Heschel for Dummies. But I'm actually trying to do something very different in this book. But I would put that on your reading list at some point, that if you haven't read it, that you would do that.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we get to visit again soon.
I'd love that. Okay. Thanks, Kim.
Awesome. Thanks.